Chapter 11. Journey to Norrland. They had travelled all morning, and for the best part of the afternoon. The train was stuffy, but when her mother opened a window, the wind that blew in seemed to be full of knives. Annika had looked out eagerly as they had crossed the Moravian hills, stopped at pretty towns with onion-domed churches, and trundled over gorges cut by rushing rivers. Now, after several hours, she was getting sleepy, and the landscape had changed. As they went north, and still further north, there was just a wide plain, patches of trees and pools of water circled by dark birds. Snow still lay in the hollows, and the gnarled trees were bent by the wind. This was Norrland, and the site of her new home. Frau Eldrat had said little on the journey, just smiled at Annika from time to time, and reached out to pat her hand. And Annika was free to imagine what she would find. The farm, the dogs and horses, and Herman, a brother. She had not dared to imagine a brother in her dreams. They did not go to the dining car, just bought some rolls from a woman with a basket at one of the stations. And Annika remembered hearing that aristocrats did not get hungry like other people, nor did they mind being uncomfortable. The seats of the railway carriage were surprisingly hard. The light had begun to fade by the time the train stopped at Bad Haxenfeld, and they climbed down onto the platform. It was bitterly cold, and a strong smell of rotten eggs drifted over from the town. Rather a grand town it seemed to be, with big hotels and a casino. So the smell surprised Annika. Was it the drains? That's the sulphur you can smell, said her mother. It's in the water. It gushes out of the rocks above the town, and that's why people come here to take baths in it and get cured. Sulphur is good for a whole lot of diseases. I have an old uncle who lives in one of the hotels here, and he has arthritis. Annika nodded. The Eggharts came here too, she remembered. They had been at Bad Haxenfeld when news reached them of the old lady's death. As they crossed the platform to leave the station, a large number of men in dark suits, 30 at least, got out of the back of the train. They had badges pinned to their lapels and obviously belonged together. I think they might be dentists, said Frau Eldrat. Unless they're undertakers. But I believe my uncle said dentists. They come here for conferences. 1 month it's dentist, 1 month it's undertakers or locksmiths or bank managers. They stay in the hotels and take the waters and talk about teeth or coffins or whatever. Annika watched the men, still streaming out of the train. As they alighted, uniformed porters with the names of the hotels in their caps fetched their trunks and suitcases out of the luggage van and trundled them out of the station, and the dentists followed. Tall dentists, small dentists, fat dentists, thin dentists. I didn't know there were so many dentists in the world, said Annika. On the road outside the station, a large closed carriage with 2 horses was waiting. It was painted black, and on the side, Annika could just make out the von Tannenberg crest. It was the same crest that had been on her mother's handkerchief. The carriage was old, with a musty smell and leather seats. The coachman was old too, and when he raised his hat and nodded to Annika, he fell silent. People did not seem to talk so much here in the north. They left the town behind them and drove for more than an hour in the gathering dusk. Annika could just make out the same clumps of gnarled and wind-blown trees, the same patches of wind-ruffled water. Then it became too dark to see, and she leaned back against the cushions and closed her eyes. She was woken by the rumbling of the carriage over a stone bridge spanning a river. Then came a second bridge, a smaller wooden one, over a moat, and they drove into a large courtyard. A single lantern came bobbing towards them, and she remembered what the Eggharts' great aunt had said about arriving at the home of the Russian count, the 100 flares held up to welcome them. But those were Russians. Russians were different, and it was long ago. "Good evening, gnädige Frau." And the old woman held the lantern, bobbed a curtsy. "Bertha, this is my daughter, Annika," said Frau Eldraut, and the old servant curtsied again to Annika. It was the first time anyone had curtsied to her, and she wished it had not been someone so old whose knees were stiff. They followed Bertha through a heavy oak door, which led from the courtyard into the main part of the house, down a long stone corridor to a flight of steps. "I think my daughter will want to go straight to bed," said Frau Eldraut, and Bertha nodded. "I've put a warming pan in her bed. Shall I bring up some hot milk?" "I expect she'll want to go to sleep right away, won't you, dear?" "Yes," said Annika obediently, though she would have loved something hot to drink. Her mother bent down and kissed her cheek. "I am happy to have you under my roof," she said formally. "And I'm happy to be here," said Annika, and followed the old servant up the curving stone steps. In the very early hours she was woken by an explosion, and for a moment she thought she was back in Vienna, and it was the Emperor's birthday. They always let off fireworks in the city that day. Then she saw the outline of the room, cavernous and strange, and got up and went to the window with its heavy iron bars. Moored on the bank of a long reedy lake that stretched away from the front of the house, she could just make out a flat-bottomed boat, and a man crouched in it, holding a gun. A flock of birds, black against the grey sky, came over. "Wild duck," she thought. There were 2 more bangs, and 2 birds fell into the water. Annika went back to bed. When she woke again, it was light, and she saw the room she had slept in clearly. She had never dreamed that she would wake in such a room and know that it was hers. The walls were covered in brocade hangings, dark and heavy, embroidered with a kind of battle scenes which Uncle Emile had shown her to explain the movements of the Panzers. There were 2 crossed swords nailed to one wall, a table with heavy carved legs, and a chair with a high leather-covered back stood in the middle of the room, and on the headboard of her enormous bed were carvings of people in helmets trampling on other people whose helmets had come off. But there were things that surprised her. The rugs on the floor were threadbare, the curtains were frayed, and the pelmets hung crooked. The tiled stove had gone out, or perhaps it had not been lit the night before. Her toes, as she put them on the ground, curled up with cold. And there were bare, discoloured patches on the wall where pictures had been removed. She dressed quickly, washing in cold water in the basin high on its stand. The von Tannenbergs must all be tall, and clearly they were strong and hardy. They weren't pampered and spoilt as she had been in Vienna, waking in a warm room, washing in warm water. Feeling for a moment rather desolate, she went to the window, and suddenly her mood changed, and she thought, no, it's going to be all right. It's going to be good. For she had almost forgotten one of the best things about her new life. She'd almost forgotten Herman. Now she saw a boy riding bareback across the fields beside the house. He was galloping, letting the black horse go full out. But what she could see, even from a distance, was the ease and enjoyment with which he rode. Perhaps Herman would teach her to ride. Perhaps... No, there was no perhaps about it. She and Herman would be the greatest of friends. Sometimes you see someone, even quite far off, and know he will become part of your life. I have a brother, said Annika aloud, and she turned from the window and hurried down the stairs. She found herself in a square hall with a stone-flagged floor. A heavy wooden chest stood against one wall, and above it, fixed to the walls, were a number of glass cases containing stuffed fish, stuffed pike, stuffed roach, stuffed perch, all carefully labelled. In one corner stood an enormous brass gong. Beside it, in a stand holding a broadsword, a cutlass, and a battle-axe. Several doors led off the hall. Which one should she take? Then, from a corridor on the left, she smelt coffee, and making her way along to it, she opened a door. She'd been right. The door she now opened led to the kitchen. It was much bigger than Ellie's kitchen in Vienna, and darker, with its high barred window. But at once she felt at home. There was a scrubbed table, an iron range, a set of copper dishes by the dresser, and it was warm. An old woman was stirring something on the stove. It was Bertha, who had let them in last night. And now, in the daylight, Annika could see how old and wrinkled she was, how tired. She must have begged to be allowed to stay at Spittal. There were servants who couldn't face that they had come to the end of their working life. "Good morning," said Annika. Old Bertha swivelled round. "Good heavens, miss! You mustn't come in here. This is the kitchen." Her Norrland dialect was hard for Annika to understand. "Yes, I know it's the kitchen. Can I help you take anything through into the dining room?" "No, no. Or what would Frau Eldred say? A daughter helping in the kitchen? Go back down the corridor and into the hall. The dining room's the second door on the right. Quickly, go, go, or I'll be in trouble." The dining room faced north over the lake. It was huge, with a long dark table, and pictures of a number of von Tannenbergs on the wall. But here too there were spaces where some ancestors were missing, and the wallpaper was stained with damp. After the warm kitchen it seemed very cold. Her mother was sitting at one end of the table, buttering a piece of bread. She was wearing a morning robe of green brocade, and her thick dark hair was loose down her back. Annika, filled with pride, ran up to her for a good morning kiss. And it was only then that she really took in that there was another person in the room. A large man with red hair, a red beard, and a long scar running down his left cheek. He wore corduroy breeches and a green Loden jacket, and a small feather was caught in his beard. A duck feather it seemed to be. Then this must be the man that she'd seen in the punt. "This is my brother-in-law, Herr von Seltzer. You may call him Uncle Oswald," said Frau Eldred, and explained that he was the husband of her sister Mathilde, who lived nearby, and that he came over most mornings to shoot. Then she turned to him. "Well, this is my Annika. What do you think of her?" "She's pretty," he said, "but not very much like you." Frau Eldred frowned. "Sit down there, dear. Do you drink coffee?" "Yes, I do, thank you." Breakfast was simple. Black bread cut into thick slices, butter, and a single jar of a kind of jam that Annika had not seen before. It was darkish yellow colour and tasted like turnips, but of course it couldn't have been. It had to be a special kind of fruit that grew here in the north. As Annika spread it on her bread, She looked across at the fourth place laid at the table. "Is that where Herman sits?" she asked. "Yes, he'll be here in a minute." "Ah, I think I can hear him now." Footsteps, the door opening, and a boy stood on the threshold. "This is Herman, Annika, your brother." The two children stared at each other. The boy did not come forward to shake her hand. Instead, still standing in the doorway, he bowed from the waist and clicked his heels sharply together and said, "Pleased to make your acquaintance." He was an amazingly handsome boy, with fair curly hair cut very short, his mother's dark blue eyes and clear pale skin. He was neatly dressed in a cadet uniform, khaki trousers, a khaki tunic with brass buttons, and high polished riding boots. And he was most definitely not the boy on the horse.